That's an extraordinary moment to be alive. We are the only species, the only generation in the only species in 4 billion years that has had the chance to read our own recipe and to read the recipe of life. It's more and more fascinating. The more we discover, the greater the mysteries that we find. It doesn't solve the mysteries, it creates the mysteries. I think I'm only on the planet once,
Right.
and it would be a pity not to spend as much of our time here as we can exploring what this world is all about. So I had a very ambitious idea to write a book that bird watchers would love because it's about birds, and that scientists would like because it's about genes and evolution. It's the male that's asking and the female that's deciding in most species. Why is that? Darwin wanted females to be consciously choosing in birds. He didn't want to make it an instinctive, unconscious thing. The Victorian naturalists had trouble with this. They thought that it's all about male-male competition deciding who's going to win. But there's a huge element of female choice in the leg. If birds are capable of doing art for the purpose of seducing females, then maybe human beings do art for that reason. This is almost unique in the animal kingdom, in knowing that you will get a great show every morning. And that's why I love doing it at this time of year when the display peaks. It's simply not true that the more technology or the more wealth you have, the more damage you do to nature. And for me, land sparing is much, much better as a way of preserving nature. The same is true for other technologies. Doing more with less enables us to tread more lightly on the planet. I am trying to blur the distinction between innovation and evolution. I think innovation is a more evolutionary process than we realize, and evolution is a more innovationary process than we realize.
As Darwin kept emphasizing and being ignored for it, sexual selection is not a peculiarity in one small corner of the natural world. It's a massive force for evolutionary innovation that we keep overlooking. This is the case made very convincingly, I think, in this captivating book, Birds, Sex and Beauty, The Extraordinary Implications of Charles Darwin's Strangest Ideas. And today I'm deeply privileged to be joined by its author Matt Ridley. Matt, thank you very much for having me today.
David, it's very nice to meet you and to be here.
So I suppose the best place to begin with this would be to ask you a couple of questions on how you came to be a scientist and then a science communicator. From what I've read preparing for this interview, it seems that you had an interest in natural history from very early on.
Yes, as a boy, my father infected me with an interest in bird watching, particularly, but in natural history generally. And as I matured, I turned that into a scientific interest. So not just wanting to watch birds or see natural history sites, but to understand them.
Right.
And for me, that was a wonderful transformation, an ability to move on from appreciating the natural world to exploring the mechanisms underlying it, going deeper and deeper into things like genetics and evolution. But it wouldn't have happened without the boyhood fascination with natural history.
Okay. It's interesting because physicist Brian Greene, the American physicist, when asked why he became a scientist, replies by saying that he couldn't envision the fact of going to the office every day without having to grapple with the big questions. What is this universe we live in? And so what was it coupled?
Very much so. It's the same. I am intensely curious about the natural world, and I think I'm only on the planet once.
Right.
And it would be a pity not to spend as much of our time here as we can exploring what this world is all about. And it gets more and more fascinating. The more we discover, the greater the mysteries that we find. It doesn't solve the mysteries, it creates the mysteries, as it were.
Right.
And we are the only species, the only generation in the only species in 4 billion years that has had the chance to read our own recipe and to read the recipe of life in terms of genetics. That's an extraordinary moment to be alive. And particularly when I was writing about genomics at the turn of the century, when the first human genome was being sequenced, I thought, this is the most important thing to happen in 4 billion years. I need to have a ringside seat. I need to be there. I need to be watching this because it's so interesting and it's much more important than everything else that's happening in the world. So for me, it is about licensed curiosity, about having the opportunity to ask big questions and try to answer them.
So the philosophical implications of the scientific enterprise were always somewhat on the back of your mind?
I wouldn't say always, because I think one starts out just being a collector of trivia and an observer, but then gradually, if you're lucky enough to get a good scientific training, the philosophical implications of understanding the world become more and more important to you. Yes.
Right. Another great scientist, John Maynard Smith, could trace his scientific career to reading Possible Worlds by G.B.S. Haldane while at Eton. And in the preface of Bird, Sex and Beauty, you hint at the fact that popular science had also an influence in your upbringing. And you mentioned Gerald Durrell, for instance. And did you also want this book to be a sort of tribute to this genre that blends scientific rigor with wonder?
I say in the beginning of this book that I was very influenced as a boy by the work of Gerald Durrell, a naturalist, and as a student by the work of Richard Dawkins, a scientist. And that what I am trying to do in this book is do some of the simply enjoyable experiencing of natural history that a good nature writer does,
right,
and some of the deep exploration that a good science writer does. I want to combine an aesthetic appreciation of nature with an intellectual understanding of nature. I think both have their place. I think they don't detract from each other. I think it's important to combine. So I had a very ambitious idea to write a book that bird watchers would love because it's about birds, and that scientists would like because it's about genes and evolution.
So did that bring particular challenges as a writer to blend these two aspects of it?
In terms of how you structure a book, you always face interesting challenges. And in this one, I wanted to describe what it is like to witness one species of bird going about its mating rituals in the early morning in one place. But you can't do that for 12 chapters. It would get boring.
Yeah.
So I also wanted to talk about the history of this idea of sexual selection, Darwin's idea, how he disagreed with Wallace on it, how he lost that argument in his lifetime, but how in the next century people like Ronald Fisher and then later others revived the idea of sexual selection through female choice and showed that it was a valid part of evolutionary theory, and that it justified Darwin's claim that it's a very different and very powerful and very eccentric form of evolution, if you like. So I was able to write, and I deliberately wrote a chapter of natural history, then a chapter of science, then a chapter of natural history, then a chapter of science.
Right.
By the end of the book, it's no longer alternating between the two. They have sort of merged.
All right.
But that was my intention.
Okay. And another thing is that each chapter begins with a poem, and we'll come back to that. But a couple of hours ago, this very morning, at a time when creeping murmur and the pouring dark fills the wide vessel of the universe, you brought me with you to a place where we could watch not a menacing French army, but a very peculiar group of animals called the black grouse. Could you explain what motivates you to wake up so early to watch a bird, which on the face of it isn't a very distant cousin to the common pheasant that we saw on the road and that we completely ignored?
You make a very good point. Most birds, their rituals of courtship are brief or unpredictable or relatively unspectacular. But some birds have these extraordinary displays that go on and on and on, and some of them are in predictable places and at predictable times, and some of them are communal. You know, many birds get together and do these communal displays. And the one that illustrates that best in Northern Europe is the black grouse. And as you saw, we were able to turn up at exactly 1 hour before dawn, and we would know that there would be, I think it was 16 male birds at this very spot. And they've been at that spot every morning for the last several months, and they've been at that spot for several years, and that they would be displaying and dancing and singing and fighting, non-stop action. Well, it wasn't quite non-stop because we had some rain, and when it rains they tend to just
Slightly,
huddle down a bit. But in between there was a terrific amount of action, and then it got even more exciting when a female turned up, as you saw.
Yes.
So what an extraordinary, predictable natural history spectacle this is, because most natural history is not predictable. You know, if you go and look for a lion in Africa, you know, you might not,
it's much
you
more
don't know where to look for it.
Yeah.
If you go and look for a certain bird, it might be in a different part of its territory. This is almost unique in the animal kingdom, in knowing that you will get a great show every morning. And that's why I love doing it at this time of year when the display peaks, even though it means that you get very short night's sleep and you get quite cold and hungry in the early morning, but you're witnessing something very special.
Yes. So we did some amateurish observing of the bird, but you're very careful in the book to give credit to all the scientists that did and continue to do the hard work of collecting data on the black grouse, particularly the Finnish team, which was led by Rauno Alatalo, whose colleagues carry on their work like Carl Salisbury. Do you view it as the essence of science communication to bridge that gap between academic researchers and the wider audience?
Yes, what you saw was a bunch of male black grouse displaying, and you wouldn't necessarily know that one is in the same place every morning, that one has slightly better plumage than that one, etc., etc., unless someone had done the science to show that. So what Rauno Alatalo did, and Carl Salisbury and his colleagues afterwards, was mark every bird, stake out every lek, so that you could recognize individuals.
Sometimes for decades.
Sometimes for decades, yeah, exactly. And you could weigh them. And so he could tell you that, for example, when the female visits the lek, she does so for several days in a row, and then she mates on the last day, and she mates only once, and then she leaves. You can't tell that if you can't recognize individuals. So for my lek, I can't necessarily prove that because my birds aren't marked.
That's right.
But in the Finnish study, they've caught them in the winter, they've marked them, they've weighed them, they've measured them. And then they know a huge amount about them. They're even now looking at their genes and seeing how many mutations they have and things like that. So the science really helps you understand what you're seeing, and you see so much more when you're able to refer to these studies. So for me, it was very important to cite these papers and these studies and the detail of what they're finding, but as a backup to telling the whole story about what's going on.
Yeah, that's right. And yes, you point out that without this painstaking research, for instance, the fact that a male black grouse peaks for just 1 year, wouldn't be accessible to just random observers.
Isn't that interesting? So, for example, people say, well, surely the species has a problem with inbreeding if one male does all the mating. But what the Finns have discovered is that the one male does all the mating 1 year, but it exhausts him and it probably kills him. there is only a 25% chance of him still being alive the following year. But that year of success might come when he's 3, or it might come when he's 4, or it might come when he's 5. In one case, it came when he was 6 years old in their study. And that somehow in that year, when he's got a chance of being the alpha male at the center of the lek who gets the matings, he will put so much effort into it that he will succeed but kill himself in the process. Right. And therefore, of course, he's not mating with his daughters the next year, for example.
Yes,
so there's there are, well, and also the discovery, which has only been possible because of radio tracking birds in this country as well as in Finland, that the females will disperse a long distance from where they're born. So they will not attend the lek where they were conceived. They will attend a different lek. So those kind of understandings have come from this research, and it helps. When I take people to see a lek for the first time, I'm able to explain what they're seeing in more detail because of all this scientific research. And I find that makes it all the more wonderful. It doesn't, there's a little bit of common myth that if you understand the world too much, you take away the mystery. Quite the reverse. I think you add to it and you elaborate it. Richard Dawkins has made this point very good. He wrote a book called Unweaving the Rainbow, in which he quoted John Keats, the poet, as saying, why must scientists unweave the rainbow? Explaining the rainbow is to kill the mystery, the magic. Nonsense. It creates new magic and more mystery.
Yes. And another thing is that these data helped to challenge the 19th century depiction or descriptions of what's happening in a lek, which is this place where the black grouse males gather. And to give our viewers an idea of what these depictions look like, I'd like to react to a much more recent depiction which was made by the BBC very recently.
For the past week, the two of them have been sizing each other up. And now, it's the showdown. Halftail has triumphed. This lek has a new boss. And his timing couldn't be better. A female has arrived. This is his chance to impress. She might only visit this lek once this year. He's been lucky this morning, but Halftail must hold his position at the centre of the lek if he's to get another chance.
With all due respect to Sir David Attenborough, his description is wrong on many levels. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, and I don't want to pick on David Attenborough. It's a wonderful piece of film, and he's a wonderful narrator.
That's right.
But that is very much like the way leks were described in the 19th century by the first naturalists who watched them. They were seen in terms of a joust, a battle between individuals that resulted in one winning and the others losing, and the others even departing the field or leaving. What you saw there was a fight between the boss and Halftail at the boundary of their territory in the lek. and it was a stalemate. It did not result in one winning and the other losing. How do I know that? Because I saw them disengage in exactly the way they do every morning with their neighbours. You saw it this morning.
Yes.
There is a confrontation at the boundary between the territories, between these two friends. They are actually friends during the day. It's only in the morning that this happens. And the confrontation is about reinforcing the point that I have this territory and you have that. And it's just reminding each other where the boundary is. And it's a stalemate. It always ends up in a draw. Not always, of course, because there might be an occasion on which one defeats the other. But you didn't see that in that one. In fact, in that fight, you saw the boss turn away first. And we know from the Finnish study that the one that turns away first is dominant over the one that turns away second. Halftail did get a mating in the image, so he was obviously fairly dominant, but he wasn't necessarily the boss over that individual. Now, what's wrong with that is that it's seen very much from the male perspective. The 19th century naturalists thought in terms of men on horseback fighting each other with lances until one wins, and then the women or the woman comes to the man and says, "Thank you very much, you're the winner."
Yeah.
But in a lek, it's the very aggregation of lots of individuals, and day after day, they're still there every day, displaying together. And that's what attracts the female. The female then wanders through the whole lek unmolested. She's not prevented from leaving the boss male's territory to visit other territories in the lek. But she will eventually come back to the one that she wants to mate with, and she will make clear that it is her choice as to who to mate. And the Victorian naturalists had trouble with this. They thought that it's all about male-male competition deciding who's going to win. But there's a huge element of female choice in the lek. And this is what is missing from that account at the BBC, but also from the 19th century Victorian accounts. So surprisingly, perhaps, the BBC has not kept up to date with evolutionary theory in this respect.
Right. It was very clear this morning that the female rule, essentially. And she sampled the male. And
several times.
Yes.
She went to the middle of the lek. She then went off in a different direction. She came back. She went off in another direction, and she came back. And only about the third or fourth time that she was in the central male's territory did she mate.
And when she arrives, the fighting between the males tend to die off, actually. And so,
well, normally that's correct, both in sage grouse and in black grouse. Edmund Selous was the first person to spot this. The fighting doesn't hot up, it actually calms down because they stop fighting over territory and they start focusing on displaying to her. In fact, this morning there was a bit more fighting when she turned up because they had, until that point, they'd been sheltering from the rain and they'd been rather static. And because she excited everyone, there was a bit of fighting between males at their territory boundaries. But where she was on the lek was nearly always the focus of several males facing directly towards her, crouching very low and singing very volubly with the rucooing sound, which makes it very clear that the purpose of the lek is to seduce the female, not to destroy the other males and thereby win the decision of the females.
Right. And this morning she had on her radar a very specific male. And you explain in the book that, and we discussed it earlier, that this one male will make most of the copulations during one season, which means that, as you mentioned, the next generation will have been fathered by the same male and will presumably be brothers or half-brothers, and therefore with low genetic variability between them. So my next question will start with an analogy. If I'm in a serious rush to get a plane and to go to the airport, and I know that the best taxi driver I can get is even 5% faster than the rest of the others, it can be extremely costly for me to go for second best. And it can be therefore worth the trouble to go through the comments and reviews to find the best of the best. But if instead I'm dealing with robotaxis, similar self-driving cars, then I can pick a random car and save some time by not having to choose. So likewise, the black grouse female could in principle go for second best when it comes to choosing a partner without having to pay a huge price. Their genes wouldn't miss their flight, so to speak. So could you explain why they nevertheless insist on choosing
Right.
this male?
Well, this is the central puzzle. I love your analogy, and but I'm not sure I'm going to stick with it because we would get too complicated. We would
Feel free to, yes.
We would disappear into our own mixed metaphor. But in the red grouse, which lives nearby here also, males and females pair up, and they form a pair, and they help to bring up the offspring together. In that case, it's very important for the female to get as good a male as she can, because he's going to be not only providing genes, but also defending her, defending the food in the territory, keeping an eye out for predators, etc. So she's got months of living with this guy. So she's got to make sure she gets a good one, right? The black grouse, the pair bond lasts for half a minute. Yeah. Maybe less, a few seconds only. She doesn't ever see him again. He's not involved in raising the offspring, so it doesn't matter if he's any good at all that kind of stuff. So why on earth does she go to such trouble to be so selective? And the answer, obviously, is that she wants the best genes for her offspring. Nothing else matters. She's not after territory, she's not after food, she's not after protection against predators. It's just genes. So she's going to be really selective about genes, and that means paying attention to the display and whether or not he's good at it, and whether or not he's at the center of the lek, and whether or not his tail is particularly large and healthy looking. She's a eugenicist in that sense. But the question is, what does she want those genes to contribute to? If she wants them just to make her offspring healthy, then I think you're right, the robotaxi is fine. You know, get a decent male and make sure you've got good, healthy genes for the offspring. But if instead what she defines as success for her offspring is the ability of those offspring to attract a mate, then she might become very, very particular indeed, because she wants to make absolutely sure she gets the very best, because the very best is the one who will get the chance in the next generation as well. And so sexual selection for so-called sexy sons, where you're not after the health of the offspring, you're after the ability of the offspring to attract females, is the only thing you care about. That kind of selection will drive really extreme extravagance, will drive the species into growing ridiculous plumage that makes it very vulnerable, but also makes it very beautiful, that makes them behave in very eccentric ways, like gathering in the same place every day for months on end. You know, the females have bred that into the males.
And the cost is immense.
An incredibly costly thing. They've done a terrible thing to these males in a way. Yep. They've imposed upon them a ridiculous and in a sense fruitless extravagance. And all because the females are descended from females that wanted to breed successful males that were successful at mating. That's the circular argument at the root of this theory. And it's a difficult theory for people to grasp because they want there to be a point. They want there to be a rhyme and reason. behind the choice. Surely she must be after good genes for disease resistance or something. But if she's just after genes for the ability to seduce other females in future, then it's sort of almost pointless, and people don't like that. It sort of goes against their instincts. But for me, it's what makes sexual selection potentially a creative force rather than just a defensive force. Natural selection, or selection for good genes for health of offspring, will be a rather conservative and mundane thing that will just say, yeah, we want you to be healthy and we want you to do this and so on. But this thing can say, we want you to have a black and white tail that's shaped curved. We want you to have bright red strawberries on your head. We want you to make a funny noise. We're going to invent new features as a way of helping to seduce females in future generations.
And that's made very clear in the book that your interest in sexual selections comes from this way to spark innovation in nature. But you also point out to a darker side to sexual selection because it can lead some species into sort of dead ends, which would translate in maybe less numerous populations and so on. So it can also lead to species not flourishing as they could ideally if it wasn't.
Well, let me give you an example of that. The black grouse, which you saw this morning, is very rare now in Britain. There are maybe 1,200 males in England at the moment. You saw 16 of them this morning. That's more than 1% of the British population in one place. Right. It's declining. Well, it's holding its own now in England, but it's declined enormously. And the same is true all across Europe. The ruff is the only other really truly lekking species in Northern Europe, and that is declining very badly and is almost extinct in England. And yes, in Scandinavia there are still quite a lot, but very few in the Netherlands now. So I think it's possible that lekking, this extravagant communal display of the males, makes the species more vulnerable. Right. And if you look at the sort of family trees of birds, it doesn't look like lekking species create lots of daughter species, as it were. It looks like they're a bit of a dead end. Not entirely, but to some extent. And you saw how vulnerable those birds were this morning. If a goshawk appeared, there aren't goshawks in this area because there isn't much forest, but if it could happen in theory, it would be able to take one morning and come back the next and get another morning, and so it could wipe out that lek. But, instead of a goshawk, let's talk about a man with a gun 100 years ago who wants to feed his family. He knows where to go to shoot a grouse every morning, and then he's got some food for his family, and before you know where you are, you've destroyed the whole lek. The predictability, which we enjoyed because it meant we knew where to find them, makes it more vulnerable to disease. They are the males are getting into close contact with each other for months on end. If one of them has a bad infection, it will spread through the lek. The same for hawks and so on. So the females have done something to the males that have led the species to be more vulnerable. Now, I don't want to exaggerate this because there are lots of extravagant species, peacocks and birds of paradise and things, that don't seem to be dying out. They don't automatically disappear. But it's a reminder of how if you are burdening the species with a particularly difficult and pointless ornament or behavior, then you are going to slightly increase its chances of extinction. We used to think that the antlers of the giant elk that lived, we find their skeletons in Ireland in particular, were exaggerated by sexual selection so much that the animals couldn't get between the trees and therefore died out for that reason. We don't think that's how they died out. They were probably hunted to extinction by people. But we do think their antlers aren't just for fighting. We think they are for showing off as well. And we know that in fallow deer, there is a sort of lecking system, and that the antlers are there for show as much as for action. So there are some cases where I think one can talk about this question of sexual selection making species more vulnerable.
Leading to, coming back to the book, one of the heroes of the book is Edmund Selous, that you have already mentioned, and it's very tangible in the book that you like him. What do you think that he deserves to be better known?
This is an extraordinary naturalist, a man named Edmund Selous. His brother was a very famous big game hunter, and after whom a large national park in Tanzania or game reserve is known to this day, the Selous. But he was a very keen naturalist, but what he wanted to do was actually watch and observe the birds. And that was quite unusual in those days. Most people would, they would shoot a few and then dissect them and study them and analyze them.
So we are talking early 20th century.
We're telling you that, yes, the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. The first 10 years of the 20th century is really when But he started getting interested particularly in these lecking birds. The ruff first, and then the black grouse, and he watched black grouse lecks in Sweden, and he then watched them in England, not very far from where we are today. I haven't actually found out exactly where, but I know they were in the next county from here. And he described these lecks in great detail, and he said, for the first time, no, it's not about males jousting till one is left holding the field. Mm. It's about males having to show off in a market to the females who then decide. Mm-hmm. And he has this wonderful phrase. He says, if only Darwin was alive for me to tell him what I've discovered, I think he would have realized that I've actually found really good evidence for his theory that female choice, not male competition, is driving the evolution of this species. He's talking about black grouse. And he said, these facts speak trumpet-tongued in favor of Darwin's theory of female choice, which I thought was a wonderful phrase. He was an eccentric man. He doesn't seem to have been very sociable or friendly to people. And his descriptions are very lyrical, very purple prose, but about how many clothes you have to wear if you're going to get up very early in the morning, and he described bicycling sort of 8 miles in the dark to get to one of these lecks. He was a tough chap, I think, as well.
Although his regrets not to have communicated directly with Darwin could be mitigated by the fact that Darwin showed little interest to the black grouse. He shot and ate black grouse when he visited the Wedgwood family. But
isn't this interesting?
Yeah.
I know. I discovered this. I searched.
You call it an infuriating lack of curiosity.
Yes. So Darwin says female choice is driving extravagant male plumage, I think. And he says black grouse have this habit of communal display in Germany, in the Alps, but apparently not in Britain.
Yeah.
And he knew the species. He had hunted it with his shotgun in Staffordshire as a young man, and eaten it. And later in life, somebody sends him some to eat, and he says, I haven't tasted these for years, and I love eating them. And when he wrote his first edition of his book, The Descent of Man, he said they don't do this lecking thing in Britain. They do in the continent. And somebody wrote to him from Scotland and said, that's not true, I've seen them gather together in one place. And so instead of saying, I better get on a train and go and see what this chap's talking about, because this could be really an interesting test of my theory.
Yes, yes.
He just puts a footnote in saying, except this chap who says he has seen this happen once. So naughty Darwin. He didn't. He was very good normally at following up on hints from his correspondence, but he didn't on this occasion.
Right. So this might come a bit late in the conversation, but natural selection, of course, is the process whereby if a characteristic increases the probability of an organism to reach reproductive age in his environment. Therefore, almost by definition, if that characteristic is at least somewhat heritable, then its frequency will automatically increase in the population. And so that's classical natural selection as explained in the Origins of Species. And so how is sexual selection different?
Well, the big difference is that sexual selection can make survival harder. On the whole, in order to reproduce through natural selection, you need to survive. We call it survival of the fittest. You are fitter and therefore you survive and therefore you get a chance to reproduce, as you say. In sexual selection, we could be selecting for features that make it harder for you to survive, but easier for you to reproduce. And I think that's a very important distinction. Darwin thought it was an important distinction, but ever afterwards, Wallace and other scientists have said, well, it's just a different version of the same thing. It's all about reproduction in the end. Yes, but survival of the fittest is a key feature of natural selection. Seduction of the hottest is the feature of sexual selection. And they can be pushing in very different directions. They can be making it harder for the individual to survive, but easier for it to reproduce if it does manage to survive. And it isn't necessarily the case that that will produce very different results, but it does in many, many cases.
And while natural selection was discussed by previous authors before Darwin, sexual selection seems to be is most original creation.
Yes, I mean the idea which he first raises in The Origin of Species in 1859, the idea that females are breeding males the way chicken breeders are breeding breeds of chicken, is completely new. Moreover, he then spends much more time thinking about and writing about sexual selection than he does about natural selection. Actually, once he's written The Origin of Species, he doesn't talk very much about natural selection ever again. In fact, he talks about directed conscious selection a lot more. He talks about domestication, which is a form of artificial selection by human beings. And then he talks about sexual selection, which is domestication by females of males, if you like. Well, I'm not claiming it's conscious, but it's not the environment choosing. It's the female choosing, and so it's not a top-down, but it's a more individual mediated form of selection. And so it's quite intriguing that Darwin actually ends up thinking about this much more. He writes a book called The Descent of Man, which came out in 1871.
And the subtitle is on
selection in relation to sex.
That's right. Yeah.
And the majority of that book is just a book about sexual selection. It's not about the descent of man at all.
Yeah.
The reason he calls it that is because he thought he needed sexual selection to explain human racial differences.
That's right. Yeah.
Actually, I think he's wrong about that. I think, for example, skin colour is a response to sunlight, lack of sunlight in the north and excess sunlight on the equator or whatever it might be. So I think it's a perfectly ordinary natural selection phenomenon. Yes. But he was very struck by the idea that different races are attracted to individuals of their own race and not of other races and things like that. Now, I don't want to go down that hole, and it's very 18th century view and all that, a 19th century view, I should say. But I do think that, but people have tended to see The Descent of Man as Darwin wanting to write a book about man, and because he'd left man out of mankind, out of The Origin of Species, and then he thought he'd better tackle on sexual selection as part of an explanation. I don't think it was that way around at all. I think he was fascinated by sexual selection. He wanted to write a book about sexual selection, and he was persuaded either by himself or someone else to make it partly about man, but then mostly about butterflies and birds and all sorts of other species that seem to show sexual differences and sexual ornaments and extravagance. So,
and as you said, even the first book supposedly about man, a lot of it hinges on sexual selection.
Exactly, and it's a curious thing. And if you look at his correspondence in the year 1868, particularly, when he's really, really focusing on sexual selection, and he has a long correspondence with Alfred Russel Wallace about this topic, with whom he disagrees, and they start off half agreeing, and they end up completely disagreeing, because Wallace won't accept the idea that females choosing particular males is what's driving the development of colourful plumage in birds. Right. He thinks that's mad. In some ways, Wallace is a more progressive person politically, but he doesn't seem to be able to accept the idea of women being in charge of mate choice.
Yeah, that's right. They meet in Down House in September 1868, and Darwin writes, "I fear we shall never understand each other." And so the problem,
isn't that extraordinary?
Yes.
It's a sort of tragedy of a meeting in a way, because these both brilliant men and with huge affection for each other. They didn't become enemies because of this, but they did disagree.
Yeah. Yes, and so one of the problems posed by sexual selection for Wallace and others also hinges on the notion of choice, as you said, and how we define that word. So I found that the Oxford English Dictionary defines choosing as the fact to take something by preference out of all that is available to choose from. And I'd like to, if you allow me, to give you another analogy. Imagine you are at a restaurant called The Lek, and you're looking at the menu, weighing up the various options. And the waiter approaches and you say, "I'll have the black grouse, please." And he replies, "Well, I'm awfully sorry, sir, but at the Lek we only serve dishes that have been intentionally chosen, and I suspect that you were merely persuaded." Something inside your...
Merely what?
Persuaded.
Right.
Something inside your brain passively reacted to what you saw on the menu, and you had no active role in it.
Yes.
And so maybe a lot of the controversy is a matter of semantics rather than...
Absolutely. This is a very important point, and I can't remember which naturalist it was after Darwin who made this point, that allowing yourself to be seduced as a female by a very good display is a form of choice. And that it's not, it doesn't help to make a distinction between saying, did she say, "Yep, okay, I definitely want to mate with you," or, "Oh my God, you've blown me away, you've swept me off my feet." They could be two sides of the same coin, as it were. And in that sense, you can see that the wooing of a female, we're mostly talking about males wooing females. There are some species where it's the other way around, by the way, but most birds it's that way around, for reasons we can go into if you want. The male wooing the female is trying to get inside her brain and cause her to behave differently, to behave receptively when it comes to mating. And her brain has evolved to be resistant to this so that she gets the best male, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
And therefore, she is going to make the male behave ever more extravagantly in every generation because her resistance to being seduced is going to increase and his ability to seduce is going to increase generation by generation. And there's a sort of arms race between the two.
Yes.
And it doesn't really matter whether you think about it as conscious female choice or giving in to being seduced. It's sort of the same thing.
I can't think of any experiment that could help us decide if it's the male that actually managed to manipulate the female or if the female was actually choosing. It's yes, as you said, two sides of the coin.
A word that I found helpful when I first wrote about this subject a very long time ago, and I was talking about peacocks in particular, was hypnosis. Is it possible that with those eye-like features that there is some sense in which the male is hypnotizing the female, is sort of making her stand still long enough to mate or something? And that's a slightly sort of sinister way of looking at seduction. You know, this is a little bit creepy here. You know, the male is hypnotizing the female into allowing him to have his way with her. But from the female's point of view, it's just another way for her to make sure, you know, I'm not going to mate with anyone unless he can really hypnotize me. So I agree with you. I can't think of an experiment that would distinguish between the two.
That's right. What's surprising is that Darwin didn't use the instinct argument to promote sexual selection. He really wanted to fight every bit of what we would call today's speciesism, and he wanted to find intermediate forms to even human so-called abilities.
Yes, this is a very intriguing point that I hadn't come across before I wrote this book, but Darwin is quite explicit in rejecting unconscious choosing of the kind that I've just been discussing and saying, no, I think the females are actually consciously selecting. I really mean that, you know, and that put quite a lot of fellow naturalists off because they thought, well, come on, these are just birds. They're not, you know, human beings and reasoning creatures. Why did he do that? And I think one of the reasons is because he was always trying to minimize the difference between humans and animals and other animals. Not to nothing, but to degrees rather than kinds. And in this respect, the argument he had come up against was that birds can't appreciate beauty. They haven't been to Oxford University. They haven't done a course on aesthetics. They haven't read Edmund Burke or Joshua Reynolds. Do you see what I mean? That's the sort of way in which the argument was being made. You know, come on, they're not. You know, they're trying to get through the day and survive and not be eaten by predators and find enough food. They're not going to have time to think about, oh my God, that's beautiful. The sunset's beautiful. The flowers are beautiful. The members of the opposite sex are beautiful. That's just a ridiculous anthropomorphism, says the 19th century scientist. And they have a point. You know, we mustn't be too anthropomorphic about these
What's
creatures.
interesting is that nowadays studies tend to bridge the gap the other way, not supposing superior abilities in other non-human animals, but sort of diminishing what we think are special. Yeah.
Yes,
So
and
that-
saying, you know,
so there's-
we're not unique tool makers,
Exactly.
we're not
and
unique.
we
in
make
this.
also
Yeah.
choice because of our hormonal state.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. This.
But I think Darwin is right to say, why can't a female have a sense of beauty like us? And he has this lovely phrase where he says, birds have almost the same sense of aesthetic appreciation as human beings. Darwin wanted females to be consciously choosing in birds. He didn't want to make it an instinctive, unconscious thing. And Evelyn Richards, in her book Darwin and the Making of Sexual Selection, argues that it was because he wanted to minimize the difference between animals and human beings. He was always looking to make these differences into differences of degree,
That's right.
of degree, not kind.
Yes.
And I think that's an important part of what he's trying to do. But it made him quite unpopular in this respect with his fellow scientists, because they thought it was a bit ridiculous to impute aesthetic qualities, aesthetic abilities to birds. And yet he makes this very explicit remark: I think the birds have the most aesthetic appreciation apart from human beings.
Yeah.
And I agree with him. I actually, I semi-seriously make the point that if you were a bird, you would find mammals very grim and boring. They don't sing.
That's right.
Human beings sing, but name me another animal that sings. They don't have bright colours. They're all brown and grey, all mammals. They grunt. They don't do sexual selection. They don't do extravagance. They don't do beauty. They don't do aesthetics. We are a bit of an exception to that. And that's partly why we feel such empathy, such interest in birds, because we're sort of honorary birds in that sense.
Yes. Yes. Well, I would argue that there is also a similar process in plants and flowering plants. But
Yes.
so
Conifers are boring.
versus
Angiosperms
angiosperms,
are
yes, and
stunning, yeah.
probably with a similar runaway effect.
Yes.
And so
Involving insects
that's right.
as opposed to females.
So, as you said, even T.H. Huxley politely declines to defend sexual selection. Wallace is even more critical, and then interests in Darwinism itself fades for a few decades. But someone has noticed Edmund Selous, and that person was none other than R.A. Fisher. It's, of course, a towering figure of the 20th century science. And it reflects not so much whether or not females are choosing, but what is it in it for them? Why are they interested in choosing? What they can hope to gain from such a choice. And so could you elaborate something?
R.A. Fisher essentially solves the problem that Darwin left unsolved, at least to his own satisfaction. And that is that why would it matter to a female to have a beautiful seducer? How can that, let's grant that they have an aesthetic sense. Why? What's the purpose of it? And Fisher says, hang on a minute. If the females have an aesthetic preference for the most brightly coloured or the most melodious male, then she's more likely to have a son that will attract other females. And so that could actually run away, and this is the phrase, of course, he uses, runaway selection, in a spectacular fashion. And females have to become more and more choosy as males get more and more beautiful, because they're desperate to try and win the lottery in the next generation through their sons. In most species, you hope your son will have one brood of offspring, but in a blackgrass, if you get it right as a female and you breed a son from a very good male who's very attractive to females, then your son is going to be very attractive to females. He might have 15 to 20 matings. He might, and each of those might produce 6 or 8 eggs. I mean, suddenly we're talking about several dozen grandchildren for you. So in order to have a spectacular success in terms of grandchildren, it's worth trying very hard as the female to be as selective as possible for beauty in the male.
And Geoffrey Miller, in his book, The Mating Mind, explained that he actually ran computer simulations of that process, and which he was apparently able to reproduce, in which he was able to reproduce these chain reaction. And a chain reaction which can begin with very humble beginnings, which sort of explains why sexual selections lead to very arbitrary directions.
Well, I think this is a very important piece of evidence in the argument that you don't find that sexual selection for flamboyant plumage in birds produces the same sort of outcomes in different species. You don't find that it's always the tail,
Right.
or it's always the wings, or it's always the crest, or it's always red, or
Or
it's
it's
always
always
blue,
dancing,
or it's always a particular kind of dance. Quite the reverse. You find completely arbitrary, random, and apparently sort of capricious exaggeration of different parts of the plumage in different ways, with different colours, with different types of song, with different types of dance. So if you just take the birds of paradise, for example, the Ragiana looks as if its back's on fire. It has this sort of flame coming out of its back. Wilson's has a bright blue bare skull
yeah.
of skin.
Yeah.
The King of Saxony, I think it is, has a sort of long ribbon of like feather coming out of the head. Every bird of paradise is designed by a sort of surrealist artist, as it were. And if you were just saying we're concentrating on making sure that we're breeding the healthiest offspring, then you wouldn't do that. You'd have one way of doing it, or a small number of ways of doing it.
To advertise for good genes.
So the very arbitrariness of sexual selection, for me, points to the sexy son hypothesis as being correct.
Yeah. No good book can afford not to have a good villain. Would you agree that Julian Huxley plays this role in yours, especially for his insistence in burying this aspect of Fisher's work?
Yes, I was surprised by what I discovered about Julian Huxley in this book, because he's a very important figure. He's a great friend of R.A. Fisher. He's left-wing, whereas Fisher is right-wing politically, but they both agree about the importance of eugenics in the 1920s and 30s, which is not something I agree with them about, obviously. Julian Huxley is the man who sort of coins the phrase "the new synthesis" for the merger of genetics and evolution by natural selection. And he writes very important, very large books, some with H.G. Wells, the science fiction writer, summarizing evolutionary mechanisms. And he studies birds, and he studies sexual behavior in birds, starting with redshank and then red-throated divers and various other species, great crested grebes, for example. But And every now and then he pays lip service to Darwin's idea of sexual selection by female choice. But he quite systematically buries it, makes it into a small footnote at best, and something that's been proved wrong, he also implies, in his various accounts of evolution. He really downplays it, and he doesn't take up R.A. Fisher's idea of the sexy son hypothesis really at all. And he says that most flamboyant plumage is not about persuading a female to mate, but about impressing other males in a fight. Well, that's just clearly not true, as Selous had shown. If you watch what they're using this plumage for, it's clearly to impress the female. He allows female choice to be there for a few species, the ruff and the black grouse are mentioned, but he doesn't think it applies elsewhere. And I think he's quite naughty in the way he goes about this, because he sort of claims to be being inclusive and comprehensive, and actually he's just quietly destroying this idea to the best of his ability. And he's very influential. And by the 1950s and 60s, sexual selection is seen as a small and controversial footnote to natural selection. And I think that's wrong. I think Darwin was absolutely right that it's a huge force that is as important as natural selection in shaping how species evolve, shaping how speciation happens perhaps, but also shaping how inventions like feathers come about. Richard Prum has this theory that feathers were invented for display before they were ever used for flight or insulation. Might or might not be correct, but he makes a case for it because he's discovered rather brilliantly that you can actually tell what colour the feathers on dinosaurs were. A lot of dinosaurs had feathers, and because the pigment cells are sort of fossilized, you can sort of tell.
That's a fascinating theory. I wonder if there is a similar one about the development of wings in insects. That would be interesting to look into.
That's a good one.
Another particularly impressive villain you mentioned is the Rackelhan. Can you describe what is a Rackelhan?
Oh, this is a horrible story. The closest cousin of the black grouse is the capercaillie, which is a much bigger grouse and lives mostly in pine forests rather than in birch forests. But they do overlap, and the females of the two species look fairly similar. And it turns out that they can hybridize. The hybrids are probably sterile. That is usually the case with interspecies hybrids. But the hybrids are like a very large black grouse without much white in the plumage. So a rather sinister looking version of a black grouse.
Yes,
And this thing is called a Rackelhan, where it appears in Scandinavia. And what the Rackelhans do is they attend leks. They're attracted to leks, and they pick a fight with other males on the leks.
They don't seem to have
because they have the longer reach, they usually quite quickly win the fight to the point of grabbing the head of the opponent, at which point they kill them.
Yep.
So they kill black grouse, and there are videos on YouTube of Rackelhans killing black grouse at leks. And there's one video that is truly horrific, really, to watch, because not only does it kill the bird, it then beheads it. It then copulates with the headless corpse. I hate even saying that, it's such a horrible thing to imagine.
But it's not for the faint-hearted.
You've seen it.
Yeah, yes. I've seen it. And the video can be found on YouTube.
And so where a Rackelhan appears in Finland or Sweden or Russia, the local people, if they know about it and if they care about it, will try and shoot it. Yep. And rightly so, I think.
Yes. And the book is dedicated to wonky tail bird. So we almost can't help to empathize with these birds.
I've dedicated books to my family, to my friends. This time I thought I would dedicate the book to one individual bird. And I was very fond of this bird because he was very distinctive. He had some kind of deformity so that his tail was always on an angle. Yes. And we watched him for 4 years on one lek and got to know him. Yeah. So he ends up having a book dedicated to him. I hope he appreciated it.
Yes. To come back to the lek, you point out the unexpected fact that actually most of the time males behave more like teammates outside of lekking hours.
Well, it's middle of the morning now. If we went to find the black grouse now, we'd probably find them feeding in a meadow near the moor, and they would be in a group. And it'd be the same group that you saw on the lek,
without the fighting.
but with absolutely no antagonism between
Right,
them.
right.
And in fact, they would be generally moving as a team. And it's a reminder that the lek is a team effort. You know, this is a choreographed event in which a large group of males is helping to attract females for the benefit of one male. They don't think of it like that because each one wants to be the male that benefits, and they're not brothers or anything. It's not. It's not. Well, there must be a degree of relatedness, but slightly surprisingly, the Finns have found that there isn't a particularly high relatedness among different males on a lek, and so they're not, in that sense, sacrificing their own reproduction because they don't mind the fact that their uncle or their brother is getting to reproduce for them. There must be a little bit of that, but they do fight quite hard and sometimes very violently on the lek. But at the same time, they are jointly helping to attract females.
An observation that everybody can make, even when living in an urban environment, is that male pigeons are very obviously more active in soliciting sexual intercourse with females than the reverse. And that simple observation sparked the imagination of another towering figure of 20th century science, Robert Trivers. Could you tell us where that observation led him?
Robert Trivers, who died very sadly just within the last month, I think. He was a Harvard scientist, very eccentric man, but we'll leave that on one side. And he observed, as you say, that it's the male that's asking and the female that's deciding in most species. Why is that? And his answer was that there's an asymmetry of investment, that the female has to grow an egg inside her. She has to lay those eggs and sit on those eggs, and in many cases rear the chicks and feed the chicks. Sometimes the male helps with that, but for example, in black grouse, the male plays no part in incubating the eggs, and plays no part in feeding the chicks, or even protecting the chicks. He invests nothing in the offspring. The female invests weeks of time, lots of energy, and lots of risk in bringing up the offspring. So her investment is much heavier than his. And therefore she is the scarce resource for the other sex to compete for. Because the male can mate with as many females as he likes. It's a small amount of effort. Of course, that's not true if you take into account all the effort he puts into displaying. That ends up being an equal investment. But the point is that the marginal investment in one more mating is extremely cheap for him. Whereas for every time a female breeds a brood, she's got to put in months of investment. And therefore this parental investment theory said the sex that invests the most in breeding the offspring will be dull coloured but decisive, will be the one that chooses, and the sex that invests the least will be brightly coloured, more tuneful, more displaying, and the chosen one, as it were. And the proof of this, of course, is the relatively small number of species of birds and some other animals in which it's the male that makes the most investment. So I studied a bird called the red or grey phalarope, which lives in the high Arctic and spends the winter at sea, but comes ashore in the Arctic to breed in marshes, and in which the female is brightly coloured, the female is aggressive, the female does a lot of displaying, the female is trying clearly to seduce males, it's just obvious watching them, and the male is dull coloured. Why is that? It's because the male sits on the eggs. He's the one who spends 2.5 weeks incubating the eggs and then staying with the chicks as they grow up. She lays a clutch, and then is off to try and find another male to lay a clutch for. And interestingly, I sort of discovered, or didn't realize I was discovering until later, but I witnessed behavior that I was puzzled by. And
the males are aggressive against.
well, the males are very aggressive to females once they're on the eggs, and I couldn't think why. And then I discovered that in some of these species, in jacanas, and I'm pretty sure in phalaropes, the females will actually destroy eggs in order to make a male available for mating again, which is exactly what happens in gorillas and lions, by the way. When a male takes over a troop of female lions, the male will kill the cubs in order to bring the females back into breeding, so that they can breed his offspring, not his predecessor's offspring. There's even infanticide involved. But the point is that the Trivers theory of parental investment is absolutely watertight, successful theory, and is really helpful in explaining, it's not a sexist thing to say males are more colourful. It's just a fact.
Right.
And we've explained why it is.
Moving on to peacocks. Why they are almost synonymous with sexual selection. They were pretty much almost completely ignored by scientists until fairly recently. And can you tell us how you became personally interested in the blue peafowl?
Yes, I was just very interested in the fact that the peacock is the obvious example of brightly coloured, flamboyant male plumage, and the one that Darwin discusses as the sort of, how did the peacock get his tail, is the sort of question that the central question of sexual selection. And yet there had been very little study of peacocks. And so I actually thought, well, I'm going to study peacocks. So I found a population of peacocks in an arboretum near Oxford, and I had a look at them, and what had been described turned out to be wrong, which was that they have harems, that a male will guard a group of females. Turned out to be absolutely untrue. The males guard a small territory, very small territory, and the females visit these territories and choose which one to mate with. So I was looking at a lek, and it's now widely accepted by everybody that a peacock is a lekking species, which makes sense because that tail is not for fighting. Harem species tend to be strong and aggressive and large, like elephant seals, for example. They're better at fighting off other males and controlling females. Peacocks are designed to seduce females, not to control them or to fight other males.
And they will almost never deploy their train while fighting. On the contrary.
Well, that's the other point, is that they don't, contra Julian Huxley, they're not using their train to intimidate other males.
Right. Yeah. So, discussing the peacock, you are quite dismissive about mythology and its input to human knowledge by mentioning how Greek mythology explained the origin of the peacock. So how would you describe your personal philosophical framework? There are cues in the book. You quote Lucretius, for instance, a few times, and you write that watching rare birds at close quarters while being serenaded by an avian dawn chorus may be as close as I get to feeling spiritually uplifted. Have you tried to come up with a systematic philosophical point of view?
Yes, I suppose we're always trying to come up with a systematic philosophical point of view. My one is very much, the phrase I would use is bottom up. I think I generally don't like explanations that require intelligent design or creation or the imposition of a power. I want to understand how spontaneous order emerges in the world. The human brain is a device of fiendish complexity. The human genome is a device of incredible complexity. The ecosystem of a rainforest is extraordinarily beautiful and ordered. These are not random things. But they did not come about because someone planned them. And there's far too much central planning in people's philosophy, in my view. That's true of my politics as well as everything else, is that I think we underestimate the power of spontaneous order, and sexual selection is, if you like, just another example of that. So, but I don't think I start from the philosophy and argue to the general points. I think it's the other way around.
Yes. So there are 73 different species of birds in the index of the book.
Is that right?
So it obviously is a book about them as the preferred playground of sexual selection. And we humans are not a highly polygamous species, but that doesn't mean necessarily that we aren't concerned by it. As the crested auklets show, for instance, it happens in pair-bonded monogamous monomorphic species. So the last chapter of the book is about us humans. Or so it seems, because in a very Darwinian fashion, you make sure that insights about our species are interspersed with facts about the bowerbirds. So could you explain a little bit about that?
Well, I found bowerbirds the most extraordinary thing to witness. These are Australian and New Guinean birds where the males have colourful displays, except the colour is not in their plumage, it's in their art.
Yes.
It's in the structures they build. And the satin bowerbird has bright blue objects, and the great bowerbird has white, green and red objects, and the golden bowerbird has white objects, and so on. And these are artists.
Yes.
They've invented art. They're building installations. They're decorating them. And these bowers have no purpose of any practical use. They're not nests or anything like that, or roosts. These are devices for seducing females. That much is very, very clear, both from the scientific studies and just from the observations one makes. So for me, it was an absolute joy to go to Northern Australia and spend a couple of weeks watching these birds and get a feel for them. And if birds are capable of doing art for the purpose of seducing females, then maybe human beings do art for that reason. Not necessarily females, it might be females seducing males in human beings, we're, as you say, a monogamous species, so sexual selection could be going both ways, or it could be going one way more than the other. And I think it does go both ways, myself.
In the kingfisher, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the bowerbirds are a good reminder to us that just because we're making artifacts as part of our cultural life, and particularly part of our sexual life, as it were, doesn't mean that evolution isn't at work here. Evolution could have shaped our aesthetic tendencies, including our ability to do art, but it could have done all sorts of other things too. Is humour an example of a sexually selected characteristic rather than a naturally selected characteristic? What purpose does it solve in natural selection? Makes you popular in the group, maybe, but does it make you more attractive to members of the opposite sex? You bet it does. That is a characteristic of the dating scene, good sense of humour, So maybe that's how it evolved. And if humour, why not intelligence generally? Why not big brains? There's something very odd about the human brain's evolution. It went slowly and then it sped up. There's a 2 million year period in which our brain got very, very big. Now, did we need a brain that big to survive on the African savannah? Well, baboons managed without it. Maybe it was sexual selection rather than natural selection that drove it. I don't know of a way of testing that theory, but Geoffrey Miller has done a wonderful job of exploring the implications of that idea. And I think it's one... Well, my point is, it shouldn't have to necessarily prove itself. It might be the default explanation. Well, why not? Why couldn't it be the default explanation for how our brains got big? Why do we have to automatically assume natural selection is the default explanation until we find evidence for sexual selection? What about the reverse?
That's right, yeah. So sexual selection could be seen as the creative force that led to the evolution of the organ driving cultural creativity and innovation. And you write the following: the pursuit of profit, which has driven much of the progress in the world, was at root more likely to have been about sexual competition than survival. And I have to say that reading that sentences, that's when the penny dropped for me. And the book changes in dimension, because on the face of it, it looks like Matt Ridley has taken a break from writing about innovation and he writes a book on birds. But actually, that links back to the rational optimist's epigraph from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Birds, Sex and Beauty, I would argue, could be seen as the prologue to your books exploring human innovation. It could be subtitled on the natural origins of innovation. And so, yeah.
Well, I think this is exactly right. I am trying to blur the distinction between innovation and evolution. I think innovation is a more evolutionary process than we realize, and evolution is a more innovatory process than we realize. Yeah. I mean, look at the bowerbirds. They are inventing technology, right? But they're evolving it. Look at an airplane. An airplane is designed by an intelligent designer, but he didn't start from scratch. Right. He took a previous design and improved it. And that chap took a previous design and improved it all the way back to the Wright brothers. So in that sense, natural selection decides how airplanes are built by crashing the ones that don't work and breeding from the ones that do. And so in a very real sense, I think all of our technology, up to and including artificial intelligence, of course, it is merely a next step in evolution. It's a fairly bold way of looking at the world, but one that I think is quite important.
Right. And you also write that the neglect of sexual selection in the study of human beings has left anthropology, psychology, economics, political science, and even social policy the poorer. As Geoffrey Miller argues, economists could not explain our thirst for luxury goods and conspicuous consumptions. Sociologists could not explain why men seek wealth and power more avidly than women. Education psychologists could not explain why students became so rebellious and fashion conscious after puberty. Cognitive scientists could not fathom why creativity evolved. In each case, apparent lack of survival value made human behavior appear irrational and maladaptive. You probably remember the dispute between Richard Levantine and Stephen Jay Gould against E.O. Wilson's Sociobiology, the New Synthesis.
Yes.
And their harsh letter in the New York Review of Books. And because they thought that E.O. Wilson's was meaning that the social sciences would become essentially branches of biology. Are we more ready now than then to make a place to biology in social sciences, you think?
Well, I think evolutionary psychology became more subtle than in E.O. Wilson's day and became more persuasive. And I think more and more people do accept that you do need to think about how behavior evolved and social behavior evolved. But there is a tendency for human intellectuals to revert to a blank slate view of the world in every generation. That, for example, in debates about gender, became very extreme in recent years again. And so it does feel like it's one step forward and, well, two steps forward and one step back in terms of this debate. And I would no longer expect an evolutionary view to triumph. I would expect it to be in a continual guerrilla warfare against a less evolutionary view in the years to come.
And the reluctance comes not only from scientists. I think that there is actual data that the general public, when asked if they prefer deterministic explanation of their behavior rather than purely explanation with also possible determining factors, but maybe social factors or something that happens during their upbringing. But if you explain that they might not have free will in the sense that they think they have, they rather detest that idea. So there might be also a reluctance.
Well, they do and they don't. I mean, I think that the history of explanations for homosexuality is very interesting in this respect, because when people started saying, look, maybe it's instinctive, genetic and automatic, it's not caused by the way your parents treated you when you were a child or an adolescent, they expected that to be a very repellent idea to people, because you want it to be something you have control over. But actually many homosexuals took the view that, no, I do want to feel that it's an innate, intrinsic part of me.
That's interesting.
And of course, for parents, it's quite nice to be told, I didn't cause my child to become homosexual.
Yes.
Like, nice is the wrong word, but it's reassuring to know that, well, no, not reassuring is the word. People who wanted to make their homosexual children give up being homosexual were, I think, significantly influenced by the arguments that, no, we've now got good evidence that this is a part of their nature and it's a mistake to try and fight it.
So that's a case where genetic determinism would be actually...
well, not necessarily genetic, because I think there is evidence that it's not caused by a gay gene.
Yes.
It's caused by probably some difference in the hormonal condition in the womb compared with other situations, which doesn't express itself until later in life, but is nonetheless difficult to reverse or change, which blurs the nature-nurture distinction.
That's right,
very much.
The epilogue of the book is about conservation, and you write that a scientific explanation was only a part of what you were seeking. To immerse yourself in a natural phenomenon that is beautiful and to convey to the reader its magic was just as big a part of my aim in writing this book. And you even call the black grouse Europe's bird of paradise. But you deplore the fact that it's now so vanishingly rare in Britain, with a 35% decline since 2005, a decline that was, by the way, already noticed by Gilbert White. And on the other hand, there are billions of domesticated relatives to the red junglefowl, known as chicken, because we value them as food. And there are only a few thousand black grouse in Britain. What can we do practically to change that?
Yeah. Well, this is something I feel passionate about, that this is a particularly wonderful species. All sorts of rare species are interesting, but this one I think is great because of its extraordinary sexual displays, and what you've seen this morning, what a wonderful phenomenon that is. And it used to be quite common all across Britain, and now it's very rare. And we have in this area been able to manage the habitat and the predation pressure so that the species is thriving in a local way. And I would like that to happen on a much wider scale. I would like to see many more places in Britain where there are meadows for the birds to feed in, rough ground for the birds to nest in, the kinds of food they need to get through the winter, but also many fewer crows, foxes and stoats, the mesopredators that are encouraged by human activity to get much more numerous than they would naturally. If they can be controlled, then the species will produce more offspring and will thrive. So, for example, from this area, we've taken 8 individual birds and transported them to a different area called the North York Moors, where there are no black grouse, but there is suitable habitat. They must have gone extinct sometime in the past. And we've reintroduced them there. And last year they bred there for the first time. And so there is hope that, we could found another population nearby. I am somewhat disappointed by how little interest the British government has in this species. They are very, very interested in how this landscape is managed in terms of the carbon emissions, in terms of the habitat generally, but they don't really grapple with the issue of one species like this. And they talk about reintroducing the golden eagle, which is good, and I'm in favour of that. But what about saving this black grouse? So it's private individuals, private organisations, and non-profits that are driving the protection of this bird and the improvement in its numbers locally, if not nationally. And I want to draw attention to the importance of the species.
I'm keen to hear your ideas on the relation between hunting and conservation.
Yes. Well, it is no accident that the black grouse is thriving in areas where there is there is active management for hunting of red grouse. Okay. The black grouse is not hunted, but it is benefiting from the hunting of red grouse.
Yes.
The hunting of red grouse is both is actually quite a expensive thing to do, both in the sense that you have to put a lot of money into making it happen, but also in the sense that you can charge a lot of money for people to do it. And so that is paying for the saving of the black grouse. And this is not unique. You see this all over the world. You see in North America, the duck hunters paying for the preservation of habitat for ducks. Right. You see African hunters paying for the preservation of habitat for buffaloes and lions and things like that. And so it's not a contradiction to say hunters are some of the best conservationists. And for a species like this, where you can't just save it in a few small nature reserves, you've got to save the whole landscape with them in it. It is actually the best way to go is to encourage the kind of responsible hunting that of red grouse that allows you to pay for the control of predators in particular, which then helps the black grouse.
Yes, well, this morning as we were watching the lake, honestly, the last thing that would cross my mind would be to take a rifle and shoot the birds. But
yes,
I've learned not to be dogmatic because, as you said, for instance, I think in Texas, the bison was completely wiped out.
Yes.
Nowadays, there is 500,000 of them.
But only because we eat them.
Only because 2% of them are hunted every year. And people are paying very good amount of money to do that.
Yes.
And so that brings a whole economic ecosystem that incites people to take care of the whole ecosystems, because people not only want to hunt bisons, they want to hunt big specimens. Yeah. And that means that they need the ecosystems that is available to sustain such a, and so
exactly.
the same is
Exactly.
true for alligators. People don't like trophy hunting in Africa, but that's one of the main reasons why there is still elephants in
Well,
Africa.
exactly.
So,
In many parts of Zimbabwe and Tanzania, there are now areas where they've given up trying to farm cattle, and they're now allowing buffalo and rhinos and lions and elephants to thrive, and it's paid for by rich white men coming and shooting a few of them, and you may not like that,
Yes.
but it puts more money into the local economy than farming did,
Yes.
and that money reaches ordinary people more. But of course, it also saves all sorts of birds that like to live in that habitat. So
Absolutely, yeah.
it can be a very effective way of conserving on a wide scale. You know, nature reserves are fine as honeypots for tourists that pay for themselves, but in a huge area of African bush with not much in the way of scenery, you're not going to get that many photographers, but you can get hunters.
That's right, and we are talking about hundreds of thousands of hectares when the largest forest in Europe is 10% of that.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
And so, and people are, I think that to shoot a lion or an elephant, it's north of $80,000, for instance.
Is
and
it?
so
Is it?
it scales pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And so, and as you said, and unfortunately, the alternative of doing photo safaris is not really a good alternative. Because it's a kind of mass tourism, because people pay less, and so mass tourism brings all.
But also the problem is that if two people want to photograph the same lion, they can do the same lion. But if somebody wants to shoot the lion and somebody else wants to shoot the lion, then they have to happen in different places. So suddenly you've doubled the amount of space you need. So you're suddenly conserving on a wider canvas.
And yes, and again, usually hunters will want to hunt beautiful big males, and that implies having a healthy environment and a healthy ecosystem. So we all have a sense of stewardship towards nature and our planet and its ecosystems. But we also know that economic growth is good, that more energy per capita is great for us. 3 decades ago, I couldn't have done this interview for either lack of available technology or its prohibitive cost. You write in the epilogue of the book, if and when the lakes in Britain fall silent, it will be a tragedy. But I'm playing the devil's advocate here, but some might say, well, haven't you watched Rachel Carson's or The Limits to Growth by the Club of Rome or Barry Commoner or Naomi Klein? They were warning us about the silent spring. They were warning us that there would no longer be odes to skylarks if Prometheus was unchained. And yet, in your books and articles, you seem, if not to endorse it, at least to go along with the modern technological development and economic growth, which inevitably comes with rationalization and specialization. So I'm keen to hear how you walk that line between...
Very much so. And it's simply not true that the more technology or the more wealth you have, the more damage you do to nature. Because the damage done by very small numbers of prehistoric hunter-gatherers to the megafauna of North America, of Australia, of Madagascar, of South America, was extreme. Many species and many genera of species extinguished altogether by a few men with spears. They didn't need SUVs and automatic machine guns to wipe out the mammoths and the woolly rhinoceroses and the giant kangaroos and all these kind of species. So the more, by getting our energy out of a hole in the ground, in the form of gas, say, by getting our food from a very small acreage by the use of fertilizer, we can actually reduce the human footprint while raising the human living standard. And for me, if you just think about farming, what is the footprint of farming? How much land do you need to produce a given amount of food? We can either farm and say, we're going to have birds and insects in our field, but because they're going to eat a lot of the stuff and there's going to be a lot of weeds, we're going to need a bigger field. Or you can say, well, we're going to produce the same amount of food, but from much smaller acreage. And then that bit is going to be devoted to nature. That's called land sparing versus land sharing, right? And for me, land sparing is much, much better as a way of preserving nature. That much is clear from all sorts of evidence. And as a species, we're now reducing the acreage of farmland.
That's right.
I mean, it has passed peak farmland and is now declining, despite the population continuing to grow, and despite poorer people becoming more and more interested in having better food and more of it. We're managing to increase yield so much faster than population that we need a smaller and smaller footprint of farming. Now, farming is only one side of it, but the same is true for other technologies. Doing more with less enables us to tread more lightly on the planet.
I see. Well, thank you for that. Again, I think that a book like Birds, Sex and Beauty is a really great contribution to the communication of science. I highly recommend it. It's available for purchase right now in paperback as well. And I also...
This is the paperback.
Yes, I also recommend the audio edition, the audiobook, which is really great. And by the way, if you think you've already read all the books by Matt Ridley, I strongly also recommend a quite enlightening biography of Francis Crick. And also, maybe you won't agree, but Walter Knoll, I kind of...
Have you read Walter
Yes,
Knoll?
yes.
Very few people have read
I think
that
it's
book.
still very much relevant today, and even though I read that you had now mixed feelings about it, but let us know in the comment section what you think.
If
Matt,
you can find it.
yes, you can find it. I did find it. So. Matt, again, thank you very
David,
much
it's been a pleasure.
of
and
your
it's
time. I'm
very, very
really
nice.
appreciative.
Nice of you to
your
make
time.
the effort to come all the way and find me in my lecking period.
That was a real privilege.
Lek watching period. I'm not lecking myself, I'm watching legs.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.